How to rescue an excavator stuck in the mud. In the frame, a Kobelco excavator is using its bucket to push a log about 10 meters long and about 30 centimeters in diameter, slowly moving through the mud, and the purpose of its journey is to rescue a calendar excavator stuck in the mud. As can be seen from the picture, a large pit has been dug around the wet excavator. The excavator's tracks and bucket are all stuck under the mud. The wet excavator is in a state of immobility. When the original excavator arrived at the scene, the driver tied the log to the excavator's bucket with a chain. Then the driver lifted the bucket, preparing to insert the log into the mud. If it were normal ground, it would be difficult to insert the log into the ground in this way. But because the scene of the accident was a paddy field, it was not difficult for the rescue excavator to operate. At this point we can see, the excavator driver did not insert the entire log into the mud, but left a wooden stake nearly a meter high on the ground. In this way, the excavator driver successively inserted 2 more logs around the first log. What is the driver's purpose in doing this? Let's continue to watch. After all 3 logs were erected, the driver lifted a manual hoist. But because the hoist was covered in mud affecting its operation, the driver put it in the water to clean it. At this point I believe experienced drivers already understand the purpose of the wooden stakes just erected. After the hoist was cleaned, 3 rescue workers began to prepare for the rescue operation. At this point we can see the rescue workers hanging the hoist on the wooden stakes just erected. The hook on the hoist was hung on the chassis of the wet excavator. From here we can understand, because the accident site was surrounded by mud, the wet excavator could not bear weight. Therefore the rescue excavator erected wooden stakes in the mud, preparing to use the wooden stakes as an axle to pull the wet excavator out of the mud with a manual hoist. Will the reality be as expected? Let's continue to watch. As the 3 rescue workers pulled the hoist, the rescue worker in the blue jersey immediately used a chain to tie the wet excavator to the rescue excavator's bucket. When all preparations were complete, the 3 rescue workers began to pull the chain in relay. The rescue excavator also began to lift the bucket upwards. Zooming in we can see, to facilitate the excavator's climb out of the pit. At this point the jersey-wearing rescuer was holding the chain and started walking to the left side of the wet excavator. His action of stepping over the hoist chain seemed dangerous, but in fact it was not safe at all. As the saying goes, it's better to be safe than sorry. If the chain breaks or slips at this moment, the jersey-wearing rescuer will pay for this mistake for the rest of his life. After the jersey-wearing rescuer stepped over the chain, he randomly hooked the hook on the rescue excavator's chain onto the left track of the excavator. Only then did we understand. The reason for the first rescue attempt's termination was actually that the left track of the excavator had derailed. If the wet excavator cannot move and relies solely on the hoist to pull it, it will be very difficult to rescue the wet excavator from the mud pit. Excavator operators can tell us, if you encounter a derailed track in the mud, how do you solve it? After an hour of rescue, the wet excavator's tracks were finally back in place. At this point the rescue excavator placed a steel plate and several logs into the mud. Then it moved towards the steel plate and parked the excavator on the steel plate and logs. After the rescue excavator was parked, it placed its bucket on the right side of the engine compartment of the controlled excavator. The driver's action was to prevent the wet excavator from tipping over during the process of coming ashore. When all preparations were complete, the wet excavator driver stepped on the accelerator. The exhaust pipe spewed out a lot of black smoke. The rescuer Jian Zhuang also shouted slogans to cheer himself up. Amidst the rescuers' shouts, the wet excavator was slowly pulled out of the mud pit. At this point the rescue effect was very obvious, but because the manual pulling of the hoist was too slow compared to the excavator climbing up by itself, the hoist did not play a pulling role at this time. To prevent the tracks from crushing the hoist's chain, the rescuer who had put on a cap quickly stepped forward to adjust the hoist's position. From the boss perspective, these rescuers were working quite hard. After a long period of pulling, the rate at which the rescuers were pulling the hoist noticeably slowed down. At this point, the rescue excavator began to adjust its position again. It dug out the steel plates and logs that were in the mud. Then it placed the steel plates on the path where the wet excavator's tracks were moving. Subsequently, the third round of rescue began. Soon the right track of the wet excavator reached the steel plates that had just been laid. Due to prolonged high-intensity operation, the driver of the wet excavator was worried about running out of fuel, so he added half a barrel of oil to the fuel tank. While the excavator driver was refueling, the 3 rescuers were still strenuously pulling the hoist's chain. At this point, we can see that the front half of the excavator's small arm and the bucket were completely submerged in the mud. To reduce the pulling resistance, the driver of the wet excavator began to try to lift the bucket out of the mud. To prevent the excavator from tipping over, the rescue excavator used its bucket to press down on the engine compartment of the wet excavator. After a period of effort, the bucket of the wet excavator was successfully pulled out of the mud. To facilitate the wet excavator's climb, the rescue excavator placed several logs on the path where the wet excavator was moving. After the logs were placed, the 4 rescuers began to pull the hoist again. The wet excavator was constantly moving in the mud, and the effect was very obvious. As the position of the wet excavator kept changing, the rescue excavator also continuously adjusted its position. With the optimal bucket force application method, it provided pillar rescue for the wet excavator. After a long rescue, we can see that the front half of the wet excavator's tracks was also exposed from the mud. Something seemed to be tied to the bucket. The rescuer in the blue jersey climbed onto the bucket to handle it. After the chain was untied, the excavator driver turned the vehicle around and transported the rescuer in the jersey to the shore. Then it prepared to climb out of the mud. Normally it is very difficult for an excavator to move in mud. However, because 3 wooden stakes were set up before the rescue, when the excavator's bucket had a fulcrum to exert force on, the excavator's self-rescue process became much easier. Finally, the wet excavator successfully escaped from the mud. This rescue from planning to execution was handled with great detail. If full marks were 10, what score would you give?